In this lesson, we'll learn about Maya's cluster deformer. A cluster is used to transform one or multiple CVs or vertices. They're great for adding extra deformations on our characters or other objects we may rig. What we'll do is work with a cluster on this bound mesh because there are certain issues we can run into if we're not careful. So to get started, we'll right-click on the mesh and choose Vertex, and we'll grab 4 vertices on the cheek. So with these selected, let's head over to Create Deformers, Cluster Options. At the top we find 2 tabs, Basic and Advanced. The Advanced tab works similar to the Advanced tab in the Blend Shape tool. So if you'd like to learn more about this, feel free to look into that video. But I'm going to go ahead and focus on the Basic tab. At the top we find Relative and Non-Relative mode. This controls how the cluster is going to perform. With a non-relative cluster, which we create by default, if we were to take that cluster and parent it to another object, as that object transforms, it's going to affect the deformations of the points connected to that cluster, almost creating an additive deformation. With relative on, we have full control over the cluster. There will be no additive deformations. So we'll take a look at that. Next we have envelope. This is how much each point will be affected by that cluster. So by setting this to 100%, we are given full control over those points as we transform the cluster. If this was set to, let's say, 0.2, we'd only have 20%. Let's go ahead and use these options, and just to double check, I'll choose Reset Settings and choose Create. Okay, so now as we take the cluster and start to pull this out, you'll see we have full control over those 4 points we connected to this cluster. With it still selected, if we were to go to the cluster output, which in this case is cluster 9 for me, we can now go to our envelope parameter, the same one we saw in the cluster options, and start to adjust this. And as we do, you can see as we decrease the amount, we're given less control over those points. So by setting this to, let's say, 0.4, we only have 40% control. Now, something I'd like to bring your attention to is the order in which the cluster was added to your deformation stack, or your input order. Let's go ahead and select our character's face, head over to the status bar, and choose Inputs, All Inputs. Another way to do that is to right-click on your mesh. You can do that from here, Inputs, All Inputs. You can see the cluster is added at the top of the list, meaning that it is evaluated last. This works from bottom to top. So what does this mean? Well, if we were to take our head control and start to rotate it, it'll almost appear as if our points are kind of lagging behind. If we don't want this to happen, it's just a matter of fixing our input order. So with our mesh selected, we can take the cluster by middle clicking and dragging. Let's go ahead and place it so it's between the skin cluster and blend shape node. Now, if we were to take our head control and start to rotate, you'll see that it's almost as if the cluster were parented to that head control. We're no longer getting the behavior we had before. So that's much better. Speaking of blend shapes, what would happen if we were to take the cluster and place it so that it is evaluated before the blend shape node? So let's go ahead and middle click and drag until the cluster is underneath the blend shape. Now as we take our head control and start to rotate it, it'll appear as if nothing happens. However, if we were to trigger our blend shape, which we can do by selecting our global control, I have this light to heavy field that regulates the blend shape tied to this character. If we were to take that and start to modify this value, you can see now we no longer see the result of this cluster, simply because of our input order. So if we wanted to see the effect of both, we'd need to make sure that the blend shape is evaluated, then the cluster. So if we were to take the cluster again and place it so that is once again between the skin cluster and the blend shape, now we'll be able to see the result of both nodes. So your import order is very critical when working with this type of deformer, or any deformers for that matter. Now we are working with a non-relative cluster. Again, that means as we transform an object that the cluster is parented to, we're going to get an additive deformation. Just to clearly show you this, let's go ahead and take our cluster and parent it to our head control. You can see that a group was created above the cluster just to preserve its position. And just to show you this, if we were to go to Window, Outliner, and go ahead and frame that group, there it is. And if we were to expand it, you can see the cluster has been parented to it. So watch what happens now when we take our head control and start to transform it. Let's go ahead and rotate it. You can see now it's almost as if the head control is also pushing those points, and it's creating somewhat of a double transformation effect. So that's what a non-relative cluster does. If you do not want that, you'd want to make sure relative is checked. Thankfully, we can do that after the cluster has been made. Simply select the cluster, head over to the attribute editor, which you can do by clicking on the attribute editor tab or by using Control A. Under the cluster attributes dropdown, if we were to now turn on relative, that problem is no longer going to exist. So now we're given full control over those deformations. The last thing I'd like to show you is that we can use another object if we like to drive the cluster without having to parent the cluster to that object per se. So just to show you this, I'm going to go ahead and undo before the cluster was ever grouped. So just undo a few times. Okay, just to double check, head over to the outliner. Okay, great. So the cluster is no longer part of that group. Let's go ahead now and create an object to control this cluster. It can be a locator. What I'm going to use is a nerve circle. With a circle made, let's go ahead and vertex snap it to the character's face, making sure our move tool is active. We'll hold down the V key and middle mouse button drag near the face. At this point, we can reorient our circle. We could also scale it down. And then what I like to do, just to clean it up for animation, is to freeze its transformations, which we can do under Modify. Alright, so at this point, with the circle selected, let's go ahead and parent it to our head control. Simply select the circle, shift select the head control, press the P key. So what we can do is define what node is going to drive this cluster. By default, the cluster handle itself is that node that we would essentially transform. But if we wanted it to be the circle, here's what we'd do. Let's go ahead and select our circle and grab its name. Simply just copy it. From there, we can select our cluster, and if you would like, you can turn off geometry selection on the status bar. That might be a faster way to grab that cluster. But now we'd want to head back over to the attribute editor and go to the cluster's shape node. So from there, we'll find a weighted node dropdown. Let's go ahead and expand that. And you'll see by default, the cluster handle is what would be our transform node. However, if we were to paste the name of our circle in, hit enter, you'll see that now the cluster shape has been parented to the circle. So if we were to now take that circle object and start to transform it, we are also going to, of course, transform that cluster. So it's pretty neat stuff. You can see that we're getting this double transformation effect still. We know how to fix that. It's just a matter of taking the cluster and making it relative. I'll go ahead and select the mesh, head over to the cluster, turn on relative. And now, if we were to take our head control and start to rotate it, no problems at all. We can go back to our control object. As we start to pull this, it's almost as the deformations are going to behave as if they were under world coordinates, simply because of our deformation order. So no problem at all. Simply select the mesh, head back over to inputs, all inputs, and drag the cluster so it is between the skin cluster and the blend shape nodes. Now, rotating our head once again, if we were to go back to our circle control object, everything is going to function just fine. Great, so in this lesson, we learned about the cluster deformer and how it can be used to add extra deformations on our characters, which is a great tool for rigging.